It happened on a night when the city felt strangely hollow, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful but alert, like something is listening. The sky had no moon, just a dull blanket of cloud reflecting streetlight glow back onto the pavement. We were standing in a small public grove behind an old cultural center, one of those forgotten green pockets wedged between concrete blocks. People passed by without noticing us, headphones in, eyes down, minds elsewhere. That anonymity was the point. He didn't look like a teacher. That was always the first surprise. No robe, no symbols, no practiced authority in his posture. Just a man in his late 40s, jacket slightly worn at the cuffs, voice calm enough that you almost missed how deliberate every word was. He had asked me to meet him there instead of his apartment, and when I asked why, he said only, "Walls remember too much." We stood beneath a banyan tree whose roots had broken through the pavement long ago. He waited until a bus roared past, then spoke softly, not in a whisper, but in a tone that assumed the air itself might be paying attention. "What I'm about to say isn't new," he said. "But it's treated as if it's forbidden. And not because it's dangerous, because it works." I remember feeling that small tightening in the chest, the signal that something important is coming. Not fear exactly. More like recognition. He told me that throughout history, the most disruptive teachings were never the ones that promised salvation later, but the ones that suggested freedom now. Not freedom from laws or governments, but from an internal structure most people never realize they're living inside. He called it a system of containment, though he admitted that any name would fail to capture it. "These aren't myths," he said, anticipating my skepticism. "But they aren't creatures with horns either. Think of them as processes. Patterns. Gatekeepers that exist wherever awareness tries to move beyond its assigned boundary." He said that whenever someone begins to sense the source, not as a belief, but as a direct inner clarity, something predictable happens. Confusion increases. Old habits resurface with force. Doubt suddenly feels rational and heavy. Life throws distractions that feel urgent but empty. People close to you misunderstand you at the exact wrong moment. Most seekers think that's proof they're doing it wrong, he said. It's actually the opposite. He explained that these gatekeepers don't need to attack directly. They don't need to punish. They only need to redirect attention, lower coherence, fracture focus. They operate through noise, not force. And they rely on one crucial thing, anonymity. If you don't know they exist, you'll always assume the problem is you. I asked him why this knowledge wasn't more widely shared, if it was so fundamental. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because institutions survive by managing meaning," he said. "A person who knows how interference works doesn't need mediation. They don't need permission. And they definitely don't need fear-based incentives." He told me that early versions of this teaching were never meant to become religions. They were more like field manuals, practical instructions passed quietly between people who had already begun to wake up. No ceremonies. No hierarchy. Just guidance on how to recognize when your awareness was being steered away from itself. But once power got involved, he continued, the manuals became myths, the instructions became allegories, and the warnings were reframed as moral failures. You weren't distracted by interference, you were sinful. You weren't confused by noise, you lacked faith. See how efficient that is? A group of teenagers walked past us laughing, completely unaware of the conversation threading between their voices. He paused until they were gone. "The truth is," he said, "the gatekeepers can't stop you from reaching the source. They can only convince you to stop yourself." He told me his role wasn't to build followers or spread a movement. His job was simpler and riskier, to make sure the knowledge didn't disappear entirely. To pass it to people who could recognize it without turning it into identity or spectacle. People who wouldn't rush to package it, monetize it, or defend it like a belief. "That's why I'm telling you this here," he said, gesturing around the grove. "No symbols. No recordings. Just memory and discernment. He warned me that once I understood this framework, I wouldn't be able to unsee it. Ordinary frustrations would start to reveal patterns. Emotional spikes would feel less personal. Certain fears would suddenly seem rehearsed, almost artificial. And you'll be tempted to talk about it too much, he added. That's another trap. Not everything wants to be named publicly. I asked him what would happen next. How someone actually moves forward with this awareness without becoming paranoid or detached. That comes later, he said. First you need to learn to spot resistance without fighting it. To notice when your inner signal drops and ask why, instead of judging yourself. Sovereignty starts with observation. Before we parted, he placed a hand briefly on my shoulder, not dramatically, just enough to anchor the moment. One last thing, he said. If you ever feel like this path is isolating, remember this: isolation is the system's favorite illusion. You're never alone in clarity. You're just harder to see. Then he stepped back, merged into the flow of pedestrians, and was gone. The grove looked ordinary again. The tree, the cracked pavement, the distant traffic. But something had shifted. Not externally, internally. A quiet alertness, like a lens had been adjusted. I walked home knowing one thing for certain: whatever these gatekeepers were, they thrived on ignorance, not power. And simply knowing to look for them had already changed the terrain. Once you start seeing the pattern, it doesn't announce itself with thunder. It shows up quietly, almost politely. That's the part most people miss. The gatekeepers don't feel like enemies, they feel like reasonable thoughts. Sensible doubts. Familiar emotions. They arrive wearing your own voice. After that night in the grove, I began to notice how predictable the interference was. Not dramatic possession, not external threats, just subtle derailments. A sudden wave of exhaustion right when clarity sharpened. An impulse to scroll, snack, distract. Old regrets resurfacing without invitation. Conversations looping back to the same unresolved frustrations. At first, I assumed it was psychology. Stress. Conditioning. But the timing was too precise. The pattern always activated when attention turned inward and steady, when awareness stopped chasing outcomes and simply rested. That's when he explained the gatekeepers more clearly. They aren't beings sitting somewhere, he said later during one of our quieter conversations. They're regulatory mechanisms. Think of them as filters built into the system that maintain a certain range of consciousness. When you drift beyond that range, correction begins. Correction, not punishment. He outlined 3 primary traps, and once you see them, you realize how elegantly simple they are. The first is emotional amplification. Small feelings get inflated until they dominate your inner field. A minor irritation becomes anger. A passing sadness turns into identity. You don't notice awareness shrinking, you just feel justified. The gatekeepers don't care what you feel, only that the feeling consumes you. The second trap is mental looping. Questions without resolution. Analysis without grounding. You think you're seeking truth, but you're actually circling it endlessly. This is where many intelligent people get stuck, mistaking complexity for depth. The third is false urgency. Sudden priorities appear. Tasks that feel important but lead nowhere. You're pulled outward, away from stillness, away from coherence. And the trick is that none of these feel imposed. They feel chosen. That's the genius of it, he said. If you think it's you, you won't resist. Most spiritual narratives frame struggle as a test of worthiness. Pass the trial, prove your devotion, earn access. But this framework was different. There was no moral evaluation. No hierarchy of souls. Just mechanics. Interference wasn't a judgment, it was feedback. When awareness stabilizes, he explained, the system responds automatically. Not because you're special, but because stability threatens predictability. And here's the part that surprised me most: fighting the interference makes it stronger. Resistance feeds the very loop you're trying to escape. Anger at distraction is still distraction. Fear of manipulation is still fear. So what do you do? I asked him. Just let it happen. Notice it, he said. Name it internally. And don't personalize it. That was the shift. Instead of asking what's wrong with me, the question became what pattern is activating right now. The emotional charge dropped immediately. Awareness widened. The trap lost its grip. He called this the first countermeasure, recognition without engagement. The second was more subtle, frequency alignment. Not in the trendy sense, no affirmations, no forced positivity. Just coherence. Slowing breath. Settling attention into the body. Letting thoughts pass without grabbing them. When awareness steadies, the noise loses leverage. The gatekeepers can't operate in coherence, he said. They need fragmentation. When your inner signal stabilizes, they simply fade. This wasn't mystical in the dramatic sense. It was almost boring in its simplicity. And that's why it was powerful. No rituals meant nothing to perform. No identity meant nothing to defend. But there was one more layer he warned me about. Once people start recognizing interference, they often swing to the opposite extreme, seeing it everywhere, suspecting every emotion, distrusting their own humanity. That's another trap. Not every bad day is interference, he said. And not every emotion needs correction. The difference is clarity. Interference compresses awareness. Real emotion expands it, even when it hurts. That distinction mattered. Pain that brings insight isn't a trap. Pain that narrows perception usually is. As this understanding settled, daily life didn't become easier, but it became clearer. Frustration still happened. Doubt still appeared. But they no longer defined the terrain. They were weather, not the sky. And then came the idea he saved for last, the one he said institutions feared most. Sovereignty. Not rebellion. Not dominance. Sovereignty meant internal authority. The refusal to outsource your awareness to fear, guilt, or external validation. It wasn't declared outwardly, it was lived quietly. When interference shows up, he said, you don't negotiate. You don't argue. You simply remain. That remaining, steady, present, unhooked, was the crossing point. Not a moment of fireworks, but a shift in orientation. You stop trying to escape the system and instead move through it. And the strangest thing? Once you stop feeding the traps, they lose interest. The loops shorten. The noise softens. Not because you won, but because there's nothing left to work with. Awareness that doesn't react, he said, is invisible to control. That line stayed with me. Not hidden, invisible. The gatekeepers can only regulate what they can detect. And detection depends on disturbance. By the time he finished explaining this, I understood why the teaching had survived only in fragments. It couldn't be institutionalized. There was nothing to enforce, nothing to sell, nothing to threaten people with. It made authority unnecessary. And that, more than anything mystical, explained why it had been buried. By the time the mechanics were clear, the fear had already dissolved. Not dramatically, no moment of triumph, but quietly, like realizing the room you were afraid of was never locked. The crossing he spoke about wasn't an event. It was a change in posture toward experience itself. He explained that most people imagine freedom as escape. Leaving the system. Transcending the world. Disappearing into something higher. That image alone keeps the loop running, because it assumes you're trapped somewhere you don't belong. You don't exit the field, he said. You stop being readable by it. That was the final shift. The third countermeasure wasn't a technique you did. It was a stance you held. He called it the sovereignty declaration, though there was nothing ceremonial about it. No words needed to be spoken out loud. It happened internally, the moment you stopped asking for permission to be aware. Interference still appeared, but it no longer felt invasive. Thoughts would rise and fall. Emotions would pass through. Urges would flicker and fade. The difference was that none of them pulled awareness off-center anymore. They were seen as movements, not commands. This is where most traditions get it wrong, he said. They teach control, suppression, purification. But the system adapts to control. It can't adapt to neutrality. Neutrality wasn't indifference. It was clarity without tension. Presence without agenda. As this stabilized, something unexpected happened. Life didn't become distant or abstract, it became more immediate. Colors sharper. Conversations slower. Decisions simpler. Not because choices vanished, but because the noise around them thinned out. He warned me not to mistake this for enlightenment or completion. That, too, becomes a trap. There's no final state, he said. There's just less interference. And with less interference comes a strange responsibility, living without the familiar friction of inner conflict. Many people unconsciously recreate chaos because it feels like identity. When that drops away, the quiet can feel unsettling at first. That's where people often turn back. They miss the drama. The struggle. The feeling of striving toward something. Freedom, it turns out, is understated. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't argue online. It doesn't recruit. It just is. He described what life looks like after the crossing, and it wasn't mystical in the way most people expect. You still work. You still deal with inconvenience. You still feel sadness and joy. But there's a subtle baseline that doesn't fluctuate, a stable signal beneath the fluctuations. This is what he meant by living from the source, not chasing it. When awareness is sovereign, he said, experience reorganizes around it. Not magically. Practically. Relationships either adjust or drift away. Certain environments become intolerable, not because they're evil, but because they're incoherent. You stop forcing alignment and let mismatch reveal itself. And here was the final paradox. Once you stop trying to wake others up, clarity spreads more naturally. People sense it without explanation. Not through teaching, but through presence. That's why the instruction was always to keep this quiet. Not secretive, just unadvertised. The moment you turn this into an identity, he said, the gatekeepers have you again. No badges. No labels. No chosen status. Just awareness, unclaimed. The last time we spoke, he didn't give me anything new. No additional steps. No deeper layers. He only repeated one thing, slowly. Whatever demands your fear is lying, he said. Whatever demands your worship is insecure. And whatever needs you unconscious cannot tolerate stillness. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and smiled for real this time. You won't need me after this, he said. That's how you'll know it worked. He was right. Not because he disappeared, but because the framework no longer needed reinforcement. It functioned on its own, quietly, in the background of daily life. The world didn't change. But the grip it had on attention did. And once that loosens, there's nothing left to escape from. If this story felt unfamiliar but strangely recognizable, that's not an accident. Some ideas don't land as information, they land as reminders. You don't need to agree with everything you just heard, and you definitely don't need to turn it into belief. The only invitation here is to notice your own experience more carefully, especially the moments when clarity appears and something immediately tries to pull you away from it. This channel isn't about telling you what to think, who to follow, or what to fear. It's about offering frameworks you can test quietly, on your own terms, without performance or pressure. Take what resonates. Leave what doesn't. Sovereignty always begins that way. If you want more stories like this, stories that explore awareness, interference, and what it means to live without constant internal noise, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. If this video sparked a new way of seeing, a like helps it reach others who might be ready for the same reflection. And if you know someone who's been questioning the invisible pressures shaping their inner life, sharing this video might be more helpful than explaining it yourself. However you move forward, move gently. Nothing here requires urgency. And nothing worth keeping needs force.